Beneath the soft sands of the Egyptian desert, far from the noise of the living world, there lie chambers carved into stone. They are quiet, still, as if time itself has slowed to a crawl. Inside these tombs, kings and queens, once the most powerful figures on earth, now rest in silence, wrapped in linen, surrounded by treasures meant to guide them into the next life. Tonight, we will journey together into those resting places. We will not rush. We will move gently, one chamber at a time, to see what lies inside the coffins of Egypt's kings, queens, and their sons, their secrets, their fears, their dreams of eternity. Subscribe to The Boring Historian for more sleepy history. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. Beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, the desert seems endless. But if you stand quietly in the Valley of the Kings at dawn, you might hear nothing but the low hum of the wind as it slides across stone. Here, beneath your feet, tunnels and corridors reach deep into the limestone hills. They were carved by human hands thousands of years ago, using copper chisels and bare determination. Imagine the stillness as a worker's hammer struck the stone, each blow echoing inside narrow corridors, carrying the smell of dust and freshly broken rock. These were not places meant for the living to linger. Every chamber was shaped with a single purpose: to prepare the dead for their journey to eternity. The tombs were dark, lit only by flickering oil lamps. The light cast shadows that danced against the painted walls that told stories of the sun god Ra's nightly voyage through the underworld. For the kings of Egypt, death was not an end, but a passage. Their tombs were their ships. The walls showed maps of the afterlife, rivers of darkness, serpents of fire, and gates guarded by gods with animal heads. The kings believed that if these walls were painted correctly, and if the right spells were inscribed near their coffins, their souls could navigate these dangers and rise again with the morning sun. But for the workers who carved these halls, the tomb was simply their labor. Many were poor men, paid in rations of bread and beer. They lived in cramped mud brick houses nearby, in a village called Deir el-Medina. While they shaped the eternal beds of pharaohs, their own graves were shallow pits in the desert sand, marked by a few stones. This contrast between the mighty and the humble is felt even today. The king's tomb was a palace beneath the earth, filled with gold, ivory, perfumes, and fine linens. The workers' resting place was the bare earth itself. As you picture these tombs, let the image be slow and still. The corridors are long, air is cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of ancient stone. You can almost hear your own footsteps echoing softly as you walk toward a chamber sealed for millennia. At the heart of the tomb rests the coffin, sometimes a single sarcophagus of limestone. Sometimes, as with Tutankhamun, nested coffins, one of gilded wood, another of solid gold, each fitting snugly inside the other like a set of sacred boxes. The silence here is complete. The desert above hums with heat and wind, but deep below, all is frozen in time. This first step into the tomb teaches us a quiet lesson, that even the greatest power is eventually humbled by the earth. The kings prepared for eternity, yet the desert has swallowed most of their names. The workers carved their legacy, but left none for themselves. In this silence, we are reminded of the fragility of memory and how the earth holds us all in the end. The journey into Egypt's tombs continues. The flickering lamplight glows against carved walls as we move closer to the object that carried a soul to eternity, the coffin. The coffin of a pharaoh was not merely a container for the body, it was a home, a protective shell, a vessel designed to last forever. To imagine how these coffins were created, we must step far away from the stillness of the tomb and return to the banks of the Nile, to the hum of saws and the soft rasp of chisels against wood. Centuries before the pharaoh's death, craftsmen were already preparing. Egypt lacked great forests, so wood, especially the prized cedar, was rare. Ships brought it slowly down the coast from the forests of Lebanon, carried over sea and river until it reached the workshops near the capital. The scent of cedar lingered in the air, rich and resinous, mingling with the dusty sweetness of sawed acacia and sycamore from local groves. Near a long open-air workshop beneath a reed canopy, the Nile breeze carries the scent of wet riverbank reeds, mixed with the sharp tang of resin warmed by the sun. Bronze and copper chisels scrape rhythmically over wooden planks, their metallic notes joining the muffled voices of carpenters. Fine curls of pale wood gather on the ground, soft underfoot like straw. The work is unhurried, deliberate, every curve shaped to match the outline of a human body. Each coffin was carved in the image of the deceased, the face serene, the arms crossed gently over the chest. To lie within one's own likeness was believed to guide the soul to recognize its vessel after death. The process was meticulous. The planks were joined together with mortise and tenon joints, held firm by wooden pegs and sealed with a warm mixture of beeswax and resin. The carpenter's hands bore calluses from long hours of sanding with smooth stones to polish the surface. Once the basic form was complete, another group of artisans stepped forward, gilders and painters whose work would transform the wooden figure into something fit for a king. Imagine a warm afternoon as the sun slants across the workshop. A gilder crushes gold leaf into delicate sheets so thin they drift in the air like petals. The faint scent of charcoal fires used to heat resin and glues hovers nearby. With brushes made from palm fibers, they dab sticky adhesive over the polished surface. Then press the golden sheets against the wood, smoothing each wrinkle with slow, patient strokes. The coffin begins to glow as if lit from within. For common people, wood alone would have been a luxury. But for a king, gold was the divine medley, eternal, untarnished, radiant like the sun god Ra. After the gold came the inlays. Thin slices of lapis lazuli, deep blue like the night sky, were fitted into carved hollows. Carnelian stones glowed with a red warmth, and turquoise shimmered with pale blue light. Symbols were added: donks for life, scarabs for rebirth, the eye of Horus to ward off harm. When the paintbrushes dipped into black and green pigments, the smell of ground minerals and plant-based dyes mingled with the sweet smoke of incense drifting from a nearby brazier. Each line was precise. A mistake could offend the gods and doom the journey to the afterlife. Beyond the royal workshops, however, lay a different world. For the ordinary farmer or fisherman, no cedar wood or gold leaf awaited. The poor were often buried in shallow pits near the edge of the desert, wrapped in coarse linen or even palm fiber mats. A few lucky families could afford a simple wooden box, undecorated and plain. The contrast could not have been greater. While kings rested in coffins layered with gold and jewels, the poor returned quietly to the sand, the wind their only guardian. Even among the nobles there were differences. Some lesser officials were buried in coffins of painted sycamore wood, decorated with modest but careful hieroglyphs, images of food, water jugs, and protective spells painted in black and red ink. These humble symbols, though lacking the weight of gold, held the same hope that the soul would be safe on its long journey. Back in the royal workshop, the final touches continued. Priests occasionally visited to supervise, murmuring prayers as they traced sacred words over the coffin's surface. The inscriptions were more than decoration, they were spells, words believed to wake the coffin at night to protect the body within. Every surface was covered, the lid, the base, even the interior, unseen by living eyes, carried lines of script meant to guide the soul in the dark. The finished coffin was heavy, sometimes several hundred kilograms. For powerful kings like Tutankhamun, there were often 3 or even 4 coffins nested together. An outer coffin of gilded wood, a middle coffin of precious metal, and an innermost coffin, sometimes made entirely of solid gold. Each layer was another shield against decay, another gesture of reverence, another step toward eternity. Think of the moment when the craftsman, after months or years of work, stepped back to see the coffin gleaming in the late afternoon light. The polished gold reflected the glow of the desert sun. The painted eyes seemed almost to watch, and the carved lips curved in a calm, eternal smile. Though made by mortal hands, it was believed to hold a spark of divine power. The laborers, dusty and tired, returned to their simple homes along the Nile, where supper might be little more than bread, lentils, and a cup of sour beer. They knew that they, too, would one day return to the sand without such grand vessels. Yet their hands had shaped the king's eternal bed. The dignity of their work lingered in the coffin's smooth curves and golden shine. This story of craftsmanship carries a gentle lesson, that the work of many humble hands can create something meant to outlast empires. The carpenters, gilders, painters, and priests all added their small part. each believing that the coffin would keep their king safe beyond death. The contrast between their fleeting lives and the permanence they tried to achieve for another reminds us how all humans, whether powerful or poor, hope in some way to be remembered. As the sun set over the Nile and the cicadas began their slow evening song, the finished coffin rested in silence, waiting for the day it would be carried down into the cool stone chambers beneath the desert sands. The coffin may have been the eternal bed, but it was not the first step. Before the king could rest in gold, his body had to be prepared carefully, reverently, and with rituals older than the pyramids themselves. The Egyptians believed that a person's body was as sacred as the soul it carried. To be preserved meant to live again. To be neglected meant to vanish forever. Let us drift back to a warm, still evening along the Nile. The sun has set behind the western hills, and the sky holds the last streaks of rose and amber light. We walk slowly along a narrow path lined with mud brick houses, toward a low building near the riverbank. This is the embalmer's house. Inside, it is dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. The air is heavy with the mixed scent of resin, honey, smoke, and spices: myrrh, frankincense, cassia, and juniper. The smell is sweet, but edged with something bitter, the scent of preservation and ritual. The body of the pharaoh lies on a tilted wooden table made of sycamore. It is smooth from many years of use. The table is designed to let the fluids drain gently toward a clay jar beneath. Round the table stand the embalmer's men in simple white linen kilts, their skin darkened by the sun and by the soot of their work. Their hands move with a strange calmness, practiced and unhurried, as if they have done this 100 times before. First, the priests begin the ceremony of purification. A bowl of cool Nile water is lifted and poured slowly over the body. The water makes a soft splashing sound that echoes faintly in the chamber, mingling with the low humming chants of the priests. The chants are deep and slow, carrying words to guide the pharaoh's spirit toward the realm of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Next comes the most delicate work. To preserve the body, the embalmers remove the internal organs. Small incision is made on the left side of the torso. The heart, lungs, liver, and stomach are removed carefully, one by one, then washed and dried. Each organ is placed into its own carved jars, canopic jars, guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. The brain is considered unnecessary for the next life, is drawn out through the nostrils with slender bronze hooks. The process is slow and meticulous, requiring a steady hand. As the embalmers work, the smell of heated resin drifts across the room, blending with the sharper scent of natron, the natural salt brought from Egypt's desert lakes. The body is then packed and covered with this white crystalline salt to dry it completely. The natron draws out all moisture, keeping decay at bay. For 70 days, the pharaoh's body rests in a cool, shadowed chamber while the embalmers wait. Outside, the Nile floods and recedes, as it has for centuries. But inside the embalmer's house, time stands still. The poor could not afford such careful treatment. Many were simply wrapped in a plain shroud, sometimes even without embalming, their bodies placed in shallow desert graves where the dry sand itself acted as a natural preservative. For the wealthy, the long-drying process, the oils, the linenol, were signs of status, proof that their memory would endure. Even in death, the divide between rich and poor remained clear. When the 70 days have passed, the pharaoh's body is removed from the natron and carefully washed again in scented water, the skin drawn tight but still whole. Priests rub the body with fragrant oil cedar, palm, lotus, and frankincense so that the skin glistens softly in the lamplight. The smell is sweet, almost floral, but faintly smoky, clinging to the linen wrappings waiting nearby. The wrapping itself is a ceremony. The embalmers cut strips of clean, fine linen. Some strips are wide and smooth, others narrow for the fingers and toes. They begin with the legs, winding the linen gently but firmly, the soft fabric whispering as it slides over skin. Layer upon layer is added, each strip brushed with resin to seal it in place. Tiny amulets, scarabs, ankhs. Miniature figures of protective gods are slipped between the layers, unseen to the eye but present to protect the soul on its journey. The arms are crossed over the chest, the head wrapped last. Painted mask, often of gold for a pharaoh, is fitted over the face. The mask bears a calm, serene expression, eyes lined in black coal. lips set in a quiet smile meant to show the eternal, untroubled form of the king in the afterlife. The soft rustle of linen, the slow, rhythmic chanting of priests, and the faint crackle of resin hardening in the lamplight filled the chamber with an almost hypnotic calm. For the embalmers, this was not merely labor, but sacred duty. They believed that every fold of linen was a prayer, every layer another barrier against decay. For them, the act of wrapping was a gift to the deceased, a bridge between this life and the next. Meanwhile, outside the embalmer's house, the world of the living continued. Farmers guided oxen along the muddy banks, fishermen cast nets into the shimmering Nile, and children laughed as they chased each other between palm trees. Most of these people could never dream of such care after death. Their bodies would return to the sand as simply as they had come from it. The wrapping of a king was therefore as much a statement of power as it was of faith. It said, "This life mattered. This soul must be remembered." It was an attempt to hold back the forgetting sands of time. When the final bandage was tied and the mask set in place, the priests laid their hands upon the mummy and spoke the last prayers of protection. A hush fell over the room, as if even the air paused to listen. The pharaoh's body was ready, no longer just a mortal shell, but a sacred vessel, preserved for the journey through the dark halls of the underworld. This long, intricate process carries a quiet lesson. We see how the ancient Egyptians honored not only their rulers, but the idea of continuity itself, the belief that life does not end with the last breath. We also see how privilege and power shaped even the path to eternity. The embalmed king and the unembalmed peasant were both human, but their fates in death reflected the same divisions they had known in life. In the dim light of the embalmer's chamber, the scent of spices lingers as the priests step back, their work complete. The pharaoh lies at rest, silent beneath his linen wrappings, the air thick with the mingled perfume of myrrh and the dusty sweetness of natron. Beyond the walls, the desert night stretches still and endless. The stars above as bright and ancient as they were when these rituals first began. Long before the tomb was sealed, before the last torchlight flickered out in the dark corridor, the story of a queen's resting place began quietly at the side of the throne. She was often the most adorned figure in the court, clothed in fine linen, scented with lotus oil, wearing gold-worked necklaces and lapis-studded rings. But the same desert wind that scoured the pyramids reminded her that even queens would one day sleep in the earth. Let us walk together, slowly, into the cool corridors of the Valley of the Queens. The sun above has begun to dip toward the horizon. The cliffs glow with a gentle amber light. A hush settles over the valley, broken only by the sigh of the evening breeze. The entrance to a tomb lies open before us, its doorway cut square into the rock face, the carved lintel painted with bright, almost luminous pigments, cobalt blue, deep red, and soft ochre. When you step inside, the outside world disappears behind a curtain of stone-cooled air. It smells faintly of dust, chalky and dry, and of something sweet lingering from ancient incense long faded. The coffin of a queen was never an afterthought. Though usually smaller than a king's, it was shaped with equal care. Egyptian carpenters chose pieces of imported cedar or native sycamore, sanding the surface until it felt as smooth as river-worn stone beneath the fingertips. Gilders applied thin leaves of beaten gold that caught the glow of lamplight like still water reflecting the sun. On some coffins, the face of the queen was carved in serene detail, eyebrows curved like painted reeds, lips softened into the faintest of smiles. Eyes outlined in black coal seemed almost alive in the flickering light. Priests and artisans decorated the lids with long painted bands of hieroglyphic prayers. Each sign a reed leaf, an ibis feather. A scarab was a word of protection, a wish for rebirth. At the edges, lotus blossoms and papyrus stems curled delicately into patterns that mirrored the river life of the Nile. Small figures of protective goddesses, Isis spreading her wings. Nephthys kneeling in devotion stood painted at the queen's head and feet, as if guarding her sleep. In the burial chamber, the air would have been heavy with the fragrance of perfumed oils amand. Lotus, frankincense, burned in bronze censers whose surfaces had darkened with age. You might hear the soft hiss of a wick in an oil lamp and the muted rustle of linen as attendants laid offerings in baskets. Pomegranates, bread, jars of honey, bowls of dried dates. Gold bangles still circled the queen's wrists. A jeweled, broad collar rested above her linen wrappings, and a tiny carved amulet of the ankh was placed near her heart. Yet for all this care, the lives of royal wives were often not as gentle as their coffins suggest. Behind the polished masks lay stories of political alliances, rivalries between consorts, and the quiet sorrow of mothers who lost their children young. Some queens were beloved. Others were set aside or forgotten when power shifted. The beauty of the coffin could not always mirror the life within. Contrast this splendor with the lives of women outside the palace walls. A farmer's wife along the Nile slept on a reed mat beside a clay hearth, her jewelry perhaps a string of blue-green faience beads. When she died, she was wrapped in a coarse shroud, laid in the desert sand, or in a simple pit dug near her family's home. No cedar coffin, no winged goddess, only the dry wind to guard her rest. In death, as in life, the line between privilege and poverty remains stark. Inside the Valley of the Queens, however, silence reigns. The coffins lie side by side in small chambers hollowed from the limestone cliffs. Faint traces of red and yellow pigment still cling to the ceilings where celestial goddesses stretch their painted arms across a field of stars. The walls tell stories of the queen greeting Osiris or offering a lotus to Hathor as she enters the western horizon, the land of the dead. Every line and color was meant to guide her spirit gently toward rebirth, like a traveler following a familiar map. The making of a queen's coffin involved many unseen hands. Carpenters bending over their workbenches in the soft golden light of afternoon, painters grinding malachite into a green powder, women twisting linen thread for wrappings, priests whispering blessings over tiny amulets. Most of these workers lived in modest houses of mud brick, eating simple stews of lentils and onions. Their own graves, if marked at all, were rough stone cairns near the desert edge. Yet their craft carried the queens into eternity. In the stillness of the tomb today, all rank has faded. The gold has dulled to bronze, the linens have crumbled into brittle threads, and the prayers on the coffins peel in tiny flakes of faded ink. But if you stand quietly, you might feel the presence of care that went into every curve of the carved wood, every painted symbol brushed by a patient hand thousands of years ago. The queen's coffins teach us a gentle lesson that remembrance often lies in the details we leave behind the thoughtful work of artisans, the quiet devotion of attendants, the hope that beauty might shelter the soul beyond death. They also remind us of how fragile that beauty is, how even gold fades and names are forgotten beneath drifting sands. As the desert night gathers outside the tomb, the air inside grows cooler and stiller. The flicker of lamplight settles on the painted eyes of the coffin, eyes that seem to watch but never move. Somewhere above, the Nile flows on as it always has, carrying reeds and birds and the voices of the living. Down here in the silence, the queens remain beside their kings serene, guarded by painted goddesses waiting in the dark for the next dawn of eternity. In the silence of the royal necropolis, there are tombs that do not belong to mighty kings or celebrated queens. Some chambers are smaller, more intimate, their carvings softer, their walls painted with scenes of gentle games and fleeting smiles. These are the resting places of the pharaoh's sons, the princes who never reached the throne, whose lives were often brief, but whose journey to the afterlife was prepared with the same reverence as their royal parents. Imagine the stillness of a late afternoon in the Valley of the Kings. The golden light stretches over the limestone cliffs, and the dry air carries the faint smell of sand baked under the desert sun. Workers carrying chisels and baskets pass one another in silence, heading toward narrow shafts cut deep into the rock. In these chambers, royal artisans once carved coffins not for rulers crowned in glory, but for children whose names were whispered only in grief. Inside one such tomb, the coffin of a young prince rests beneath a veil of fine dust. It is smaller, its wooden surface, polished smooth, lacquered in black resin that is darkened with the centuries. Gold leaf once clung to the edges of the lid, outlining the delicate features of a face carved to resemble a boy who would never grow older. Around the coffin, amulets were arranged carefully. Tiny scarabs, protective eyes of Horus, and miniature Shabti figures that were meant to serve the boy in eternity. The story of these young princes begins in the courts of their fathers, born into privilege, They were wrapped in linen, embroidered with gold thread, tended to by nurses, and instructed by priests in the sacred texts. Yet, despite their exalted birth, they were not safe from the frailty of life. Illnesses that spread quickly in the crowded palaces, accidents in the training yards, or sudden fevers often claimed their lives before they could inherit the throne. The Nile carried abundance, but it also carried disease, and even the son of a god king could not always be saved. Take, for instance, the princes of Amenhotep III, whose reign in the 14th century BCE was one of prosperity and grandeur. He had several sons, but only one survived long enough to rule after him, Akhenaten. The rest remain largely forgotten, their names recorded only in fragments of inscriptions, or small coffins discovered inside chambers that were never meant to be opened again. The sorrow of their loss lingers in the painted scenes, images of boys seated beside their mothers, playing with birds, offering flowers to the gods. Their faces painted with the innocence of youth. The preparation of a prince's body was a solemn ritual. Just as the pharaoh himself would be, the boy's body was washed in cool water drawn from the Nile at dawn. Its scent fresh and sweet beneath the desert air. Priests chanted low hymns as strips of linen, soaked in oils of cedar and myrrh, were wound around the fragile limbs. Layers upon layers built a cocoon meant to preserve what was left of him. The air in the embalming chamber was heavy with the fragrance of resin and the warm spice of cinnamon, a scent that clung to the wrappings for centuries after. Their coffins often bore inscriptions meant to comfort the grieving family. A prayer for safe passage across the sky with the sun god Ra. Plea for Osiris to welcome the boy as gently as a father would embrace his child. Sometimes a tiny golden necklace or a favorite toy was tucked within the wrappings and echo of the life he once lived. These gestures, simple yet profound, remind us that even in the highest palaces of Egypt, love and loss were deeply human. The lives of these royal sons also highlight the vast differences between classes in ancient Egypt. While the young princes rested in elaborately painted coffins, their burial shrouds woven from the finest linen, the children of farmers and craftsmen, were often laid to rest in the earth itself, wrapped in a single cloth, if their families could afford it. No golden amulets guarded their journey, no prayers were carved above their graves. The disparity between these burials reveals a world where, even in death, the privilege of status followed one's soul. The brief lives of the pharaoh's sons remind us that mortality spares no one. The Egyptians believed that by preparing their dead with care no matter their age, they could secure for them a future beyond the horizon of this world. They saw death not as an ending, but as a continuation, a journey that needed guidance and protection. In the stillness of their tombs, these young princes remain, their carved faces serene, as if asleep. Time has worn away the bright pigments of their coffins, and the silence of centuries now surrounds them. But their presence whispers of the fragility of life and the enduring hope of a world beyond. Perhaps as you imagine these chambers cool and dim beneath the desert rock, the air still carrying a faint trace of ancient incense, you can feel a gentle kinship with those who stood there long ago, grieving the loss of a child and preparing him for eternity. The sorrow of their parents was softened only by their faith that the next life would welcome these boys into the fields of reeds, a paradise where they could run freely under the warm Egyptian sun. And so the coffins of the pharaoh's sons, though smaller and simpler, hold not only bodies, but also the quiet hopes of hearts broken too soon. The lesson left behind is one of remembrance. Even the smallest coffins can tell the greatest stories, for they hold the weight of dreams unfulfilled. Beneath the endless Egyptian sky, where the Nile winds its way through green fields bordered by desert, the wealth of a person's life determined not only how they lived, but also how they were remembered after death.
Oh.
Nowhere is this more visible than in the stark contrast between the coffins of the powerful and those of the ordinary. To the pharaoh and his kin, coffins were thrones for eternity bright with gold and gemstones, sealed with prayers and sacred spells. To the poor, they were often little more than simple wooden boxes, or sometimes merely the earth itself. Imagine for a moment the dim light of a royal burial chamber. Oil lamps flicker softly, casting a golden shimmer across the polished surfaces of an elaborate coffin. The air smells faintly of incense-sweet frankincense and resinous myrrh burned to please the gods. The coffin of a pharaoh stands tall, its surface covered in gold leaf that glows even in the half-light. The carved face on the lid is serene, lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, as if the king is already at peace. Hieroglyphs march in neat columns along the sides, promising spells of protection, food for the soul, and safe passage across the sky. In that same moment, beyond the thick stone walls of the tomb, far out in the village beyond the river, another funeral might be taking place. The air there smells not of incense, but of damp earth and straw. The coffin is rough-hewn, a wooden box made from local sycamore or palm, sometimes not even shaped to the human form, merely a straight box nailed together by the village carpenter. If the family was too poor to afford even this, the body might be wrapped in mats of woven reeds and laid directly in a shallow grave, with the desert sand serving as the only cover. The difference between the two worlds was vast. The royal coffins often contained layers: an inner coffin, carved of wood, gilded with gold, and sometimes even a second or third outer coffin that fit like a nesting shell. Some were inlaid with lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian, colors that gleamed like fragments of the sky and the river. These materials were not only beautiful but sacred, chosen for their protective power. For the wealthy nobles' coffins were sometimes painted in bright ochres and blues, decorated with images of winged goddesses spreading their arms in welcome. By contrast, the coffins of laborers and farmers were plain, their surfaces sometimes smoothed by hand, but rarely painted. The wood would splinter and crack with age, for it lacked the costly coatings of resin or varnish that protected the coffins of the rich. The names of the dead, if written at all, might be scrawled in simple ink on the lid, soon fading under the harsh desert air. The smell of the royal workshops was a heady mixture of beeswax, warm resin, and freshly cut cedar shipped across the sea from Lebanon. Craftsmen worked carefully with chisels, their hammers tapping softly as they carved faces meant to resemble the deceased. The scent of polished gold mingled with the aromatic sawdust that collected in piles at their feet. In the village carpenter's hut, the smell was different, coarse sawdust, perhaps a trace of smoke from a nearby fire, and the sharp tang of palm wood drying in the heat. These contrasts in material reveal more than wealth. They speak of the ancient Egyptian belief that the body was the house of the soul. The pharaoh, regarded as divine, was thought to deserve a house of eternal splendor, hence the gold, the jewels, the multiple layers of protection. The poor, whose souls were believed to be equally subject to judgment, but not blessed with earthly power, were often left with the simplest of shelters for the eternal journey. The disparity extended to burial goods as well. A royal coffin might be surrounded by alabaster jars filled with scented oils, delicate alabaster cups, and tiny statues of servants meant to work for the deceased in the next life. Nearby, you might find game boards, jewelry, and even chariot symbols of wealth meant to follow the dead. The poor were fortunate to be buried with a single clay jar of water or bread for the journey, often leaving this world with nothing but a hope and a prayer whispered by loved ones. This division was felt deeply by the living too. While nobles and royals could afford priests to recite the lengthy Book of the Dead at their funerals, guiding the soul with precise spells, the commoner might receive only a short blessing from a village priest if one was available at all. In this way, privilege shaped not just life, but the path to eternity. Yet even amid such inequality, there was a shared thread, the human desire to be remembered. whether in a coffin plated with gold or a reed mat tucked beneath the desert sand. Every burial reflected a hope that the person's essence would survive the darkness of the tomb and reach the light of the next life. When we look back on these burials now, we often focus on the glitter of the royal coffins, the treasures and elaborate masks. But the humbler graves tell us another story, one of resilience and quiet dignity. Though the poor could not afford gold, they shared the same faith as the pharaoh, that the journey continued beyond death, and that care for the body was an act of love. Perhaps the greatest lesson in this contrast is that death reveals the boundaries. Society builds boundaries that crumble over time. The gold that once dazzled now lies tarnished beneath the earth, while the simple wooden coffins, though forgotten by most, still hold the same human stories. In the cool silence of the tombs, gold and wood rest side by side beneath layers of sand and stone, equal at last under the patient gaze of eternity. It is a gentle reminder that wealth and poverty may shape our memorials, but in the end, they cannot alter the destiny we all share. When you step into the hushed stillness of an ancient Egyptian tomb, the walls themselves seem to breathe. Dim lamplight glides across painted surfaces, revealing lines of hieroglyphs that ripple like waves frozen in stone. Winged goddesses spread their arms across the plastered ceilings. Falcons, scarabs, and lotus flowers bloom in eternal color even after millennia of darkness. These are not decorations in the sense we know them. They are messages, spells, and symbols placed with solemn purpose, intended to speak to gods and spirits on behalf of the soul that lay within the coffin. Imagine the chamber just after its completion. The air smells faintly of wet plaster and powdered pigments ground from minerals malachite for green, cuir for deep red, soot for black outlines, and ground lapis lazuli for brilliant blue. Artisans dressed in simple linen crouch close to the walls as they carefully paint scenes of a river flowing across fields of reeds, of celestial boats sailing toward the rising sun of the deceased, standing before the throne of Osiris. Their brushes, made of split reeds, glide with soft whispers against the walls. Outside, the desert wind sighs through the cliffs, yet within the chamber, there is only the quiet rustle of bristles and the low murmur of prayers. The spells that covered these walls were not random poetry. Many came from texts we now call the Book of the Dead, a collection of sacred words meant to guide the soul through a dangerous afterlife. There were passages to help the spirit cross the lake of fire unharmed, to pass the gates guarded by serpent demons, to convince the 42 judges in the Hall of Truth that one had lived an honest life. Some spells even instructed the heart not to betray its owner during the final weighing against the feather of Ma. Each line painted or carved was thought to carry power if recited by the gods themselves as the spirit approached them. Symbols were just as crucial as words. Simple eye painted near the coffin, known as the Eye of Horus, was believed to guard against harm and to grant healing. A scarab beetle, often carved from dark green stone, symbolized rebirth and transformation, reflecting the beetle's habit of rolling the sun-like ball of dung across the ground. The ankh, shaped like a looped cross, promised eternal life. Even the colors had meaning. Blue represented the waters of the Nile. In the heavens, green signified growth and vitality. Gold evoked the flesh of the gods and the warmth of the sun. Pharaoh's coffin often carried some of these same messages, gilded in gold or inlaid with turquoise and carnelian. Across the smooth, cold surface of the coffin lid, lines of hieroglyphs curled gracefully like vines, each one intended to speak on behalf of the king's soul. The wooden surface beneath the gold would have smelled faintly of resin, for every layer was sealed against the dry air of the tomb. Priests believed that by surrounding the coffin with protective words and sacred images, they were not merely honoring the dead, but creating a shield of magic against the forces that might disturb the eternal sleep. For the wealthy nobles, spells might be written on papyrus scrolls and placed beside the body inside the coffin, rolled tight and tied with a linen string. In some burials, these scrolls were tucked into tiny wooden boxes decorated with blue lotus petals. Their ink faded, but still legible thousands of years later. For the poor, the messages were often fewer and simpler. Perhaps a single carved scarab or a clay amulet in the shape of the Eye of Horus. Yet even these humble charms carried the same hope, to speak to the gods when the human voice could no longer be heard. The air inside a sealed tomb would have changed over the centuries. At first it held the scent of burning incense, fresh paint, and the earthy tang of damp plaster. Over time, as the air dried, it grew cool and still, heavy with silence, until all that remained was the faint dust of pigments and the brittle crackle of ancient linen. Yet the walls kept their messages, waiting patiently in the dark for an eternity that the painters themselves never lived to see. The contrast between classes can be seen even in these painted spells. A pharaoh might have entire chambers covered in verses as walls, a library of incantations, while a humble worker could only afford a single carved formula scratched into a limestone shard. The powerful could commission entire books written in flowing hieroglyphs. Poor entrusted their souls to a few symbols. It was an inequality that echoed the structure of life above the ground, yet it also showed a shared faith. All believed in the journey beyond, even if they could not all afford the same maps. One of the most haunting messages found in royal tombs is a spell meant to remind the living to respect the dead. Do not disturb my rest, for the gods will hear your footsteps. These words, painted in delicate strokes beneath the gaze of a falcon-headed Horus, show the pharaoh's belief that even in the afterlife, dignity required protection. Many modern visitors feel a quiet shiver upon reading such lines, as if the stones themselves are whispering a warning across the ages. As you picture these chambers now, dim and cool beneath the layers of desert rock, the flickering torchlight of an ancient painter casting shadows on the wall, it is easy to imagine the devotion that went into every symbol. These were not just decorations, but lifelines, meant to carry a soul safely through rivers of darkness toward the first dawn of eternity. The lesson here is simple, yet profound. Human beings across all times and cultures have tried to leave messages for the unknown future. Some carved in gold, some drawn in ochre on the walls of a humble tomb, but all reaching out beyond death, trying to ensure their story continued. The painted secrets of Egypt's coffins and tombs remind us that words and symbols, even the smallest, can outlast the voices that first spoke them. Long before the first hieroglyph was carved into the stone walls of a tomb, the ancient Egyptians understood that the journey into the afterlife was not merely a passage of spirit, but a ritual of the senses. To them, scent was sacred and invisible bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. Even as we explore these burials thousands of years later, the traces of these ancient perfumes, faint but lingering, speak quietly from the darkened chambers where the dead once lay in honored repose. Picture the slow, deliberate preparations inside an embalming workshop along the banks of the Nile. The late afternoon sun filters through narrow slits in the mud brick walls, casting lines of gold across rows of clay jars and alabaster vessels. The air is warm but heavy with the mingling fragrances of resin, myrrh, cedarwood, cinnamon, and honeyed beeswax. Workers move with calm purpose, their linen garments brushing softly against the packed earth floor. Somewhere in the corner, a brazier of charcoal smolders, sending up a ribbon of sweet smoke that drifts lazily toward the high rafters. The priests who oversaw this part of the burial treated the preparation of scents as a sacred duty. They believed that these oils and perfumes were not simply pleasant, they were divine, imbued with the power to purify the body and soothe the gods who would welcome the soul. Frankincense, carried across desert caravans from distant lands, was reserved for the most solemn moments. Myrrh, thick and golden brown, gave off a warm, spicy aroma that clung to the wrappings of the mummified body like a blessing. As the embalmed body of a pharaoh was finally ready to be dressed for eternity, the priests would anoint it in layers of fragrant oil. First, the cool, clear oil of cedar seeped gently into the linen bandages, sealing them against decay. Then came the resin of pine and fir, their sharp, clean scents, mixing with the sweetness of myrrh, until the air around the coffin seemed heavy and warm. Drops of liquid myrrh were brushed along the brow and chest, believed to shield the soul from harm in the night sky. The final touch was a delicate sprinkling of powdered cinnamon and cassia, whose exotic, almost fiery scent signified wealth and reverence. For the royal dead, this perfumed preparation created an atmosphere unlike anything we encounter today. Imagine entering a newly sealed tomb, the torches still burning low, their flames releasing the scent of beeswax. The mingled aromas of incense, resin, and herbs filled the air so completely that the cold limestone walls seemed to hold the fragrance. It was a scent that spoke of life even in the presence of death, a reminder of gardens in bloom, of trees and distant mountains, of spices carried across deserts by traders who crossed entire continents. For the wealthy nobles, the funerary scents were similar, but often less lavish. Their coffins might still be lined with aromatic resins, and priests would still apply scented oils, but perhaps not in such abundance or variety. The poor, by contrast, rarely had access to such luxury. A villager's burial might involve a simple washing of the body in Nile water, perhaps accompanied by a small clay cup of oil if the family could afford it. The scent that lingered in their shallow graves was more of earth and red mats, without the protective perfume that embalmed the wealthy. This difference in atmosphere is almost unimaginable, the cool, sweet, resinous stillness of a royal chamber compared to the dry, plain scent of the open sand. Yet both speak of care given in the ways each family could manage, revealing the tenderness that endures even through poverty. The presence of scent played more than a ceremonial role. It was believed to aid the deceased soul in navigating the thresholds of the underworld. Fragrant smoke from burning keffiyeh blend of honey, wine, raisins, and spices was thought to guide the ka, the vital essence of a person, through the darkness of the tomb and up toward the stars. The rising smoke, curling and twisting like a silver thread in the torchlight, symbolized the soul's ascent to join the gods above. Archaeologists who first entered sealed tombs often described faint traces of these ancient aromas still clinging to the wrappings of the dead. Even after centuries of darkness and dry air, the resins preserved whispers of their original fragrance. These sensed the sharp sweetness of myrrh. The earthy undertones of cedar were like fragile time travelers, carrying the memory of ancient rituals across thousands of years. As you imagine standing in such a chamber now, let your senses linger on these impressions. The flicker of torchlight casting soft shadows on golden stone, the cool touch of the limestone walls against your fingertips, the quiet hum of incense still burning in a corner releasing a slow, steady ribbon of smoke, the lingering perfume of oils embedded in the bandages of the royal coffin. There is a calm heaviness in the air, as if time itself moves more slowly in the presence of these scents. The lesson carried by this perfumed history is subtle but profound, while gold and jewels gleamed for the eyes. It was the unseen element, the scent that created the sacred atmosphere of burial. The Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but the continuation of life's journey, and they honored that passage by surrounding the departed with fragrances meant to comfort and protect them. In the end, the perfume of death tells us something deeply human. Across centuries and cultures, people have sought to soften loss with familiar smells flowers at a modern funeral. Incense in temples, candles lit beside graves. The ancient Egyptians' devotion to scent reminds us that even in grief, there was a yearning for beauty, for memory, and for dignity. Today, the oils have dried and the incense is burned away, but the quiet fragrance of devotion lingers in the stories the tombs still whisper. It invites us to remember that while death may claim the body, the rituals we create to honor it through sight, sound, and even smell are what keep the memory of the departed alive. In the hushed chambers of ancient Egypt's temples, mid the flicker of oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows on painted walls, profound belief guided every burial ritual. Death was not the end. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was more than a river of life. It was also a symbolic bridge between worlds, a flowing boundary between the warmth of the living and the cool, eternal realm of the dead. They believed that the soul, known as the Ka and Ba, would leave the body at death, yet it still required a home to return to, hence the meticulous care of the physical remains. The coffin was more than a box of carved wood or hammered gold. It was a sacred vessel for the soul's return, an anchor that tied the immortal essence to the world it had once known. Imagine the gentle night winds carrying the scent of lotus flowers from the river. Edge's priests whispered invocations in the dimly lit halls of a temple. Their voices echoed softly through corridors where painted murals of green reeds and blue waters depicted a world that mirrored the fertile banks of the Nile, lush, serene, and eternal. The journey to the next life was often described as a passage across celestial waters, led by the god Ra in his golden boat. To the pharaohs, this voyage was not just a dream, but a promise that they would join the gods, sit beside Osiris in the field of reeds, and live in a perfected version of their earthly existence. The common farmers and laborers, too, held on to the same hope. Though their coffins were far humbler, often made of rough wood or even simple reed mats, still, each held symbols painted or carved by loved ones. Birds in flight, the rising sun, or the gentle ripples of water, all reminders of a journey that lay ahead. The embalming oils and fragrant resins served not only to preserve but also to protect, as they were believed to guard the soul against the chaos lurking in the unseen realm. A faint, bittersweet perfume of myrrh and incense clung to these bodies as they lay ready for the journey, like a soft promise of divine favor for those who could afford it. Boat-shaped models were placed inside tombs, tiny replicas of the vessels that would carry them down the sacred river of eternity. Beside them, painted spells lined the walls of the tomb, guiding the soul through the perils of the underworld, the monsters, the deserts of fire, the serpent Apep, who sought to devour Ra's sunboat each night. The words were thought to come alive, protecting the dead as they navigated the dark passage toward dawn. There was a quiet comfort in these beliefs. Families who stood at the edge of the tomb could take solace in imagining their loved one not gone forever, but traveling on two greener fields, across the gentle currents of a river that had always given life. They might picture them greeted by ancestors, their hearts weighed against the feather of Ma, at a symbol of truth and balance and finding peace.
Oh.
Even among the poor, who could not afford intricate paintings or precious amulets, the belief endured. A simple charm made of clay or a few hand-drawn symbols on a shroud were enough to say, "You are guided. You are not alone." These ideas of a continuing journey brought order to the mystery of death and hope to the living. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an abrupt severing, but a soft passage like drifting from the sunlit Nile delta into the slow, misty twilight of another better world. In reflecting on these beliefs, we see how the human heart, whether royal or humble, seeks meaning in life's final crossing. The Nile, eternal and ever-moving, mirrored the hope that beyond the horizon life flowed on in another form. Through the gentle current of this faith, grief was eased, and as the last stones were placed to seal the tomb, those left behind could whisper their farewells, trusting that the river would carry their loved one into eternity. Calmly subscribe to The Boring Historian for more sleepy history. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. Beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, where the desert stretches in endless waves of ochre and gold, the tombs of kings and queens once stood proud and unmistakable. But over the centuries, the sand crept forward. It moved silently, grain by grain, like the slow breath of time itself, covering carved stones, sealing doorways, and swallowing the names that had once been spoken with reverence. Imagine standing at the edge of the desert in the cool dawn, when the air still carries a slight chill, and the horizon glows faintly pink before the heat of the day arrives. The wind is almost silent, stirring up only a few dry whispers across the dunes. Long ago, these same winds would have carried the prayers of priests as they stood beside open tombs, speaking the names of the departed so their souls would live on. To the ancient Egyptians, to be remembered was to continue existing in the afterlife. To be forgotten was to face a second death. Yet time is a patient sculptor. The Nile shifted its course over centuries, leaving once thriving necropolises further and further from the life-giving water. Villages changed, empires rose and fell. The priests stopped chanting, and the echoes of devotion faded. The royal tombs, once dazzling with gold and bright pigments of red, blue, and green, fell into shadow and silence. There is a particular kind of stillness that fills a forgotten tomb, the heavy scent of dust and dry stone, the hollow echo of your own footsteps on ancient floors. Many of these resting places lay undisturbed for thousands of years, the sand preserving what the living world had lost. Wooden coffins, once bright with paint and lined with linen, became brittle and faded. Gold and lapis lazuli dulled beneath layers of grit. Some kings, like Ramses II, were remembered in grand inscriptions on temple walls. Others, less fortunate, were entirely erased, their monuments broken by rivals, their names scratched out by successors, their coffins lost beneath shifting dunes. The people who once mourned them had long since turned to dust themselves, and the stories they told disappeared with them. This quiet erasure was not limited to kings. The young princes buried near their fathers, the the queens who once ruled beside them, and the workers who built their tombs all faced the same fate: silence and sand. For all the riches buried in these tombs, the carved hieroglyphs meant to last forever. The carefully painted spells for eternal lifetime proved to be the most unrelenting force of all. Yet in this slow burial by the desert, there was also a kind of peace. The sands became guardians, shielding these ancient people from looters and storms, keeping their world frozen in the stillness of forgotten centuries. When modern archaeologists brushed away that sand with careful hands, it was as if the pharaohs, queens, and their children were given a second chance to be remembered. Think of Howard Carter in 1922, descending with a candle into the tomb of Tutankhamun, whose name had almost vanished from history. The flickering light revealed treasures untouched for 3,000 years, evidence of a boy king who had been nearly erased by both politics and the passage of time. Through that discovery, Tutankhamun's name was spoken again, as though the sand had been keeping his memories safe for a future age. There is something deeply human in this cycle of remembrance and forgetting. The Egyptians built tombs to defy death, to write their names into eternity. Yet nature reminded them, and us, that all things fade eventually. The monuments crumble, the stories blur. Even the greatest kings become whispers in the desert wind. And still, when we look upon their coffins today, chipped and faded yet undeniably regal, we feel a connection to their hopes. They too longed to be remembered. They too feared the weight of silence. It is a reminder that time humbles all, but also that memory can be rekindled, even after centuries of darkness. The sands that once swallowed their names now yield them back to us. And as we speak those names once more, Hatshepsut, Sut, Ramses, Nefertari, Seti, Tutankhamun, we honor the very human desire to be remembered, not just for greatness, but for having lived. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind in the tombs, that memory, like the desert, shifts and drifts, but it never entirely disappears. Calmly, softly, history reminds us that even in hardship, people endured. Now you may rest peacefully.